Good morning, everyone. I'm just getting the slideshow sorted. Hopefully you can all see that okay. My work has predominantly been from an agency perspective, and interestingly, in that context, there's certainty when an event is either imminent or a few days away if a flood is predicted. And in that context, a lot of our communication advice is to lead with behaviour-oriented messaging. So evacuate now, stay informed, prepare to evacuate. So it's really fascinating to take the shift and look at weather warnings where there is uncertainty about what might be happening today. And those of you in Australia, in Queensland, the area that I'm from, our state, we've been warned of severe weather, thunderstorm, heavy rainfall, hail today as well. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out and the communication that comes as a result of that. But today is really a chance for me to share some observations of research around trust, the concept that we all talk about and we all feel and behave around, but in the context of severe weather, and to get some insight and input from you towards a potential research project that we're looking to kick off as part of this group. So I've done a lot of work in trust, and my school is the business school, so I do come from that perspective. Forgive me if that's offensive to some people, but we've worked a lot with corporations as well as government, and together with one of my colleagues, Brooke Liu, who's based at the University of Maryland, we did an audit of research from government in risk and crisis communication. It felt like doing a PhD all over again, let me tell you. But we analysed a lot of articles from multiple contexts, and I wanted to share that overall, we see trust researched, we see trust measured, but we don't always see it defined. And there is a really critical difference in how some definitions of trust. And the most common definition in the natural hazards domain was actually around social trust, which mimics some of the more managerial definitions of trust that you may be more familiar with. That this is an example of Segrest's definition for social trust. And when we look at how trust is conceptualised and measured, there are likewise multiple theories that researchers will signal to or reference when they're talking about trust in the context of their research. But we find differences with how they're measured. So some will use a single item scale, others will use multiple scales, and those of you who are familiar with some of the management researchers will also talk about the notion of trustworthiness as a driver for trust, and so we'll measure trustworthiness factors as well as trust items. But we're also seeing, and our colleagues today on the panel have looked at trust in the forecast or trust in information, and the notion of trust in others, whether we have trust in others, generally community, to support some of the decisions we might be making and support our safe outcomes. But when we look at the specific measures that are being used, there's some general item anchors like do you trust, yes or no, and then more deliberate ones or definitive ones around confidence in technical skills of risk managers, just giving you an example here. But overall, because there is quite a bit of variation in how trust is measured, but then differences and or absences of the conceptualization of trust, it's hard for us to get a full sense of where we are at in terms of weather and severe weather warnings. So what we are looking to do is really try to leverage that for our project. But to give some context for how we've looked at trust within the severe weather context, I wanted to look at what are some of the antecedents of trust and then what are some of the impacts of trust, which I've conceptualized here on this slide for you. So the researchers today have looked at forecast inconsistency, the severity of forecasts, perceptions around forecasts, in addition to other variables we would often use: risk perception, comprehension or knowledge of events or weather, and certainty. And all of those factors can influence trust, either trust in the organisation or trust in the forecast or information. And trust, if we look at the impact of trust, it can likewise influence risk perception, but also people's protective action intentions, which could be seeking information, sharing information, but also following any guidance or instructions that might be part of the content there. Some of the research that we've just done also shows trust linking to affect, which can subsequently lead to protective action intentions as well. So I guess trust is complex, and but there is a lot of call in the literature for us to not overcomplicate how we treat trust, and to remember its kind of origins and how we would use it in an interpersonal setting as well. Trust is also influenced by the differences, individual differences, so and also geographic differences in some of the research. So and culture can play an influencing role there as well. And a lot of that research is more from overseas audiences than it is from Australian audiences. We tend to trust a little bit more in Australia at the moment. I'm not sure what the read is like. Victorians might have a view on that, given our current COVID environment. But that there are some national differences and international ones to be mindful of here as well. So where I wanted to land today, and really happy for there to be a lot of questions around this, and you know, critique it as much as you'd like. We want to try to move towards some consistency on definitions, theories and measures to support ongoing research. Now, that certainly doesn't mean we just want a siloed view on things, but to enable equivalent understanding of research and findings. We believe that moving towards that would be more useful for us to gather that maturity as a field in this area. And critically, I'm quite an applied researcher as well. So to be able to support our meteorologists and forecasters to look at information and how information and content might be presented to support. Generally, I'm community oriented, but thinking about Thomas's presentation, perhaps it's also you know, that interface between weather agencies and emergency services organisations too. So a couple of our proposed research questions for feedback is: how do high impact weather warnings currently signal trustworthiness? And I've deliberately dialed it to trustworthiness as an antecedent for trust, because it gives us the content, the ability to look for that content. So of some elements of trustworthiness that we look at from a management point of view are competence, integrity, and benevolence, but there are many others that are considered within the risk literature as well. And the second research question is: what are the components of high impact weather warnings that create issues for or enable trust, risk perception, and protective action intentions? And I note all of that because I guess we want to look at what is the value of trust and its influence on our end user, whoever they might be. So a deliverable from this piece is a conceptual model, or maybe even we maybe even do some empirical research to support our meteorologists and forecasters build trust as in the lead up to high impact weather. Also really keen to understand what high impact weather options are of interest to the team. So in Australia, we tend to talk about bushfires or wildfires and severe flood or flash flooding kind of events, but happy to hear other options there. So that was it from me in terms of a presentation, but I might keep this slide option up and then happy to shoot to questions, Sally, if that's
perfect. Thank you very much, Amisha. That's really interesting. Okay, well, while people get questions onto the Q&A chat function, I've got one from me. What do you think are the most important things Met officers should consider when building or maintaining trust with forecast recipients?
One of the things we've been speaking about is showing a little bit more about the data that's informing the decision. We've seen in the public health context that when a recommendation or information is being put forward, understanding the process that leads to that decision is a critical driver to help people know which one to believe, especially if there are differences that are coming through. I think that's useful. In Australia, we have our Bureau of Meteorology, which we call the BOM, and even my 6-year-old knows to Google and look at the BOM radar. But there are also other weather providers or translators of weather content too, and I think some of the others can be a little bit more definitive in what they want to do or provide an interpretive lens, which could be usefully considered by our bureau as well.
Okay, thanks, Misha. I've got a question here. Do you have any comments on how many false alarms does it take to lose or diminish trust? And I know this is a massive topic and it's of high interest to a lot of people. So do you have any insights on that?
I don't, alas. I don't have a number. I know that, so I don't want to throw to you too horribly, Susan, but I know you've done some work around false alarms in this context too. I don't have the magic number for you, but what I can say is we completed a study in July this year, and we specifically looked for message fatigue for bushfires and flood events, and it's quite a low. There's low levels of message fatigue for those two hazard types, if that helps.
Yeah, my understanding is that the context does matter, including past experience and people's proximity to the hazard and things like that, and where you are in the season. So I think Brenda Mackey from Australia's work has shown that, I'm sorry, Brenda, if you're listening and I get this horribly wrong, but the earlier you're on in the fire season, the more people are okay to take false alarms, but then as they get towards the end of the season, they're not so willing or something like that. So there's a lot of context that goes on. But my understanding is that forecasters, and this is across all hazards, can hesitate a little bit to put out these warnings just in case it does end up being a false alarm, a false positive. But in reality, people's perceptions aren't actually that bad. People are still willing to actually respond to the warning just in case they're going to get impacted, and therefore there shouldn't really be that much hesitancy to issue these warnings. Yeah, I don't know if any of our other panelists have anything else they'd like to say on that matter about warning fatigue while we're on it. Feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. No willing participants. Okay.
I can.
Yes, Thomas.
Yeah, maybe just one comment I had it in my talk as well is that I think that a lot of people are afraid that there will be warning fatigue, but when it's that's really depending on the severity of the event, and when the event is severe enough, you don't see a lot of warning fatigue anymore. So these little events which come up too often, they tend to annoy the people, and that's when we talk to a lot of people. They say, yeah, that's something that annoys me. But when you ask them, oh, could you want less information? They say, no, please keep me up with the information. So there's yeah, that's something I would say it's not that easy to answer. It is If you ask them, do you want to have more information? They say yes. If you ask them, and is it too much? They say yes as well. So so it really depends on what decision you have to make. And I think one of the issues, maybe I just skipped through try to answer some of the questions coming up in the Q&A panel. And I think one of the issues, really main issues, is that we are talking about really severe events around the world, and because we have like a global audience here, it's about hurricanes and floodings now there, and we talk about winter storms, and then we have some really small but ticky, itchy events which can impact an organization or an individual personally and affect them, but it's just about the decision if I'm getting wet from the rain or whatever, and I get a thunderstorm warning and it's not happening, but so what? It's not a big problem. So that's one of the things I think we have to always keep in mind, that it's the weather event and the forecast can mean something totally different to all people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you very much, Thomas. Okay, Amisha, we'll move on to another question. Got one here from Deanna. How do you see economic or social statuses impacting trust levels, and what strategies have you seen as being effective in mitigating trust and engagement issues?
So yeah, I haven't seen it with economic in terms of what we've read in the literature, but there's certainly social around different cultural populations or ethnic backgrounds will have an influence on trusting, but ways to counter that have been to take a more localized view to trust and using alternate kind of spokespeople from the community to support the messaging. And you probably have seen that a lot with COVID-19. We saw a big shift with some of our regional hospitals from the whole of government or whole of state message to seeing the doctors saying, we're here to protect you, you stay at home. Those kind of using the different voices, I think is a critical way to try to counter some of those perceptions around trust.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here from Jen Henderson. So this is about the definition of trust, and do we need to be consistent across the different, different projects? Is it that the context and the different theories and approaches might mean that a different definition of trust and the way we measure it is legitimate, rather than striving for consistency? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I hate seeing everyone be the same, and I'm not suggesting for us to all be robots with what we're doing, but trust has different definitions, and when you look at them in detail, some will talk about a willingness to be vulnerable to another party, and others won't consider that piece. Others will consider vulnerability, but then look at that in terms of the absence of being able to monitor somebody's actions. So I think that level of depth is critical to be able to work out what your philosophy for trust is for any project. And some will be quite functional about whether trust is there or not, and others will take a more nuanced view. So I think it's whatever it is you choose to do, that there is a reflection up, and there is that alignment up and down with the research, rather than just taking for granted that we know trust and we assume a knowledge about trust, but making sure there is that aligned application would be my recommendation.
Okay, cool, thank you. And one final question for you from Chris Noble. Will you investigate the role of government in supporting trust? So, for example, in backing the one authoritative voice, or in mandating its use for warnings, for example?
I think it would be useful to do that in high impact weather, and I'm giggling because it also depends on how different countries or states, territories communicate about high impact weather events. we tend to see in Queensland, but also in other states in Australia, that whenever there is a high impact weather, our Premier will communicate, then it will be backed up by uniformed emergency services commissioner, and then we'll see the Bureau of Meteorology offer a perspective as well. So there is that kind of coupling of sources and positioning around that, but I think it would be useful to tease out some of the differences. But we do know from our work that politicians are, less trusted, and other researchers have also found that, than a uniform. But our bureau team don't wear uniforms. I'm not suggesting you should, but there is a distinct authoritativeness that our community members perceive with the uniform. So I think it's almost a contest in some ways, but yeah, considering the different sources is important.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amisha. I appreciate that. So we've got about 8 minutes left to have a bit of a panel discussion. So keep the questions coming. We've had some really good ones, and we'll make it to the wider panel now. So we've got a couple here. And it's talking about, there's one from Renee, in light of COVID and Black Lives Matters, how do you incorporate legitimate distrust of the public and government, which extends to weather agencies? I'm wondering if anyone has any comments they'd like to make on that. Amisha, do you want to have a try at starting with that?
I think it's interesting, one of my PhD students is looking at the notion of distrust and starting from that position of distrust rather than from the positive position of trust. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different perspectives that are out there, and in some cases the distrust is very much part of the personality or the individual, for valid reasons, but acknowledging those differences and kind of constantly talking about the facts. I suspect we would see it less in a natural hazard context than we would in a more social context. So I think in some ways the natural hazards risk communicators are buffered by that, but how that leads to other things in a public health context with vaccinations and can be a challenge. We do see in natural hazards people choosing to stay in their home when a flood is in their area. So certainly you see the non-safe or non-compliant messaging and responses, but I don't think we can ever expect 100% compliance. I think we just have to acknowledge distrust is going to be there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm not sure we're ever going to get 100% compliance. So I think, yeah, it's good to strive for, though.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question now that I'd like each of our panelists to answer, if you can. I think we have probably a lot of people who are joining us today who just kind of want to know, should I be putting uncertainty into my weather warning or not? And so in a nutshell, do you think forecasters should include uncertainty in their weather warnings? So we'll start with Susan.
Can you hear me? My answer is simple. It's yes, I think you should. And as we've shown in a lot of research, having a number that you can assign to it really helps. I know there are many, many situations where that's not possible, but I think that acknowledging uncertainty is really important for users to trust the information that you're giving them, because I think we've shown in many studies that they have all sorts of intuitions about this. They don't expect for forecasts to verify exactly. They think that extreme forecasts are going to verify closer to normal values. They think there's more uncertainty the further into the future you go. So they have all sorts of intuitions about this. So I think having valid uncertainty information not only increases trust, but it provides users with information that they can apply to their own decisions, so that they can make decisions tailored to their own situation.
Yeah, I agree. All right, thank you very much, Susan. Thomas, would you like to go next?
Yes, I can keep it simple as well, because my answer is yes as well. And I would just add to Susan's remarks that I think it's very important to be open and transparent about any information you give out. And this is also includes uncertainty of a forecast, for example. So I don't think it will enhance trust. It will allow the user to have to make the decision based on their own experience. And but maybe to add, I think it's important to have like a kind of guidance, so that if people cannot understand what it's meant by this information, they can ask someone, ask for clarification, ask for better understanding. And in some situations, it might not be necessary to give a very long and full text with a lot of details, because it's quite easy to understand that you don't need that much of detail. And then you can, yeah, you can just leave it with a simple message. I would say it this way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Thomas. And Amisha.
I support the points that Thomas and Susan have made. Communicating uncertainty is critical, because we're not just looking at weather as a situational event, but a long-term relationship with whoever our end users might be. And to give a slightly different kind of view, we had seen a few years ago where a forecast was delivered as being, this is going to be a 10 out of 10 storm affecting this urban metropolitan area, which led everyone the next day to prepare. You know, everyone was cleaning out everything and taking time off work to prepare for this storm, which didn't end up hitting that area, but hit another area. As we know, weather has unpredictable elements to it. But when you lead with that level of definitiveness, I think it can be a real challenge. So balancing the uncertainty, and again talking about this is how we come up with these data, is a useful option.
Thanks very much, Amisha. So we're just about at our wrap-up time, and I know there is so much more we would like to say about this topic, and just want to point out that there are a lot of experts in our audience. As much as I don't like using the word audience as a communicator, I'd rather the two-way conversation. So if there are people online that know of particularly good review articles on the topic of communicating uncertainty and the role of trust and beliefs, or they've done the research themselves, or you just have a favorite document, you know, whatever. If you want to put that into the Q&A function so that people can look at it, or we could use it for our review even, that would be really useful as well. So please feel free to pop those into the Q&A. We can hold this session open for a few more minutes to make sure we can publish and collect all of those, and they'll be in the recording as well for later looking at for anyone. So this is the first in a series of webinars that are being held by the High Weather program. The people that have registered for this event will be emailed the link going forward for each of those individual webinars. So feel free to pop along to those if you want to. There are also workshops that are going to be held on the 1st, 2nd and 3rd of December. The 1st of December is on citizen science. The 2nd is on the value chain and end-to-end warnings. And the 3rd of December is towards the perfect warning with an emphasis on partnerships. So I invite you all to submit abstracts to present at any one of those workshops. If you email Martin Wegman from the WMO, who emailed you the link to this webinar, you can submit your abstract, say which workshop or date you want to attend and what your preferred time is, and specify the time zone. So for example, you'd put UTC in there. And there are good time zone converters online to help you do that. So if you submit your abstract, we can let you know what the program will be for those workshops, but I invite you all to come along to those too. And you need to do that by the 19th of November, please. Otherwise, I'd like to say a great big thank you very much to our panelists. You've done an awesome job, and thanks to Andrea for co-hosting this with me, and again to Martin for organising it, and especially to the audience for coming along. I know it's very awkward times around the world, It's getting quite late over in some parts of the world, and Amisha will be ready for breakfast. So thank you very much for coming. You'll be sent the recording, and I wish you all the best for your day and night. Thanks very much.